We're in the University at Albany Library's Department of Special Collections and Archives, and we're the main repository on campus for collecting archival records, historical records, and primary sources that are used by students, teachers, professors, scholars, journalists, and many others to do historical research. The National Death Penalty Archive was started here at the University at Albany in 2001. It was a partnership between the archivist here in the Department of Special Collections and Archives and faculty members in the School of Criminal Justice. There is no National Death Penalty Archive for documenting the fascinating history of capital punishment in the United States, so we set forth to establish the first death penalty archive. And what we do is we reach out to key organizations, significant individuals who are working either to abolish capital punishment or are proponents of capital punishment. And these individuals and organizations form the ideas that frame the debate that goes on both in the legal arena and the political arena over the death penalty. What I want to show you from the National Death Penalty Archive today is a collection from a gentleman whose name is M. Watt Espy, Jr. He is recognized as the foremost historian of the death penalty in the United States. He began doing research on the death penalty in the late 1960s while he was a traveling salesman, became so fascinated with crime and capital punishment, and at that time he was a proponent of the death penalty, but he became so fascinated with the topic of the death penalty that he quit his job as a traveling salesman and dedicated his life to documenting every single person executed in the United States since the beginning of this country. When he started his work, there was estimates in the scholarly community that were 5,000, maybe 6,000 people executed in the United States. After his 3 decades of work, he documented nearly 16,000 people executed. And he collected all of these primary sources, and I'm going to show you some of these documents from the collection right now. So here is a picture of Watt Espy in his home in Alabama, surrounded by the walls of his home that he had framed with people who were executed. And these are the kinds of things that he went to small city governments, county governments, doing local research to document. His goal was to document every single person executed in this country. One of the persons that Espy compiled information on was the youngest person to be executed in the United States in the 20th century. And if you think about the history of capital punishment, some themes draw out. One of the things is the execution of children. This has been debated, and ideas and perspectives have been given on this. Is it right to execute children? Another theme is it proper to execute people who are mentally ill? Another issue that is drawn out in the history of capital punishment is the factor of race in determining sentencing of capital punishment. It's been statistically proven by David Baldus and others that race is a mitigating factor in capital punishment sentencing. So these themes of race, of executing the young, executing the mentally ill, are some of the themes that you can draw out of the collection. So here we have George Stinney. George Stinney was 14 years old when he was convicted of killing an 11-year-old girl in South Carolina in 1944. He was 14 years old. He was barely 95 pounds, dripping wet. He was 5 foot tall, and he was swiftly convicted and executed within 3 months of his crime. Now, when he was executed, he was put in an electric chair. Of course, this was built for adults, so they could barely get the straps around his wrist and around his legs. He was so skinny and thin. But this speaks to the issue of do we want to execute in this country people who are children? And then he would create an index card on that individual person. So here we see George Stinney, and this is Espy. He created this card. talks about barely 14 years old, where he was from in South Carolina, March 24th, 1944. He encountered an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old girl who worked with George Stinney's father, it seems like, and eventually a fairly brutal crime was committed. And it says here, speedily brought to trial for the death of Miss Binnicker. He was convicted and sentenced to die. The indictment for the murder of Miss Thames was prosecuted, but he did not receive the death sentence. No appeal. Clemency was denied by Governor Olin Johnston, who stated that, quote, the brutality of the crime negated any consideration of his youthfulness. After his conviction, he admitted to the murders. And then it goes down. Stinney made no comment after entering the death chamber with a Bible tucked under his arms, and the guards had difficulty strapping his slight form in the chair, which had been designed for adults. At the time of his execution, he was only 14 years, 5 months old. And then he cites where he got that information from. So the Espy papers contain about 90 boxes of records, index cards on 16,000 people who were executed in the United States. The first person executed in the United States was 1608 in Jamestown, Virginia. George Kimball was executed for espionage. His father managed a bank, so I don't know if this ledger had any connection to that. But he wrote down every single person once he discovered that they were executed. So he started off with the ledger. It's much, and so you'll see here, he lists their name, their occupation, what city they came from, the crime, the age, the motive, the date, all the factual information about the person executed. So you'll see we're in South Carolina here. And if you just turn, here is South Carolina. And here is George Stinney, black, 14. It's interesting that he first calls George Stinney a child, but then crosses that out and calls him a student. So the county where he was from, his crime, murder, and he adds here of 11-year-old white girl, and then his date of execution, June 16th, 1944. So you can see here how meticulous Espy was in his research. The ledger itself goes from about 1968 to about 1982. And then he went to the index card method. But it's clearly the most comprehensive collection on people executed in the United States, from the very first person in 1608 till when he stopped working, I think around 2005, he stopped collecting. He became somewhat ill. I think one of the things that he would say is that he started off as a proponent of the death penalty, but as he did his research, as he realized that people who were innocent were executed, again, people who were children were executed, people who didn't have the mental capacity all the time to know what they were doing in a crime. One of the interesting things connected to the death penalty archive that is not necessarily part of Espy's research is the idea that some of the organizations whose records we have they are groups of murder victims and family members of murder victims who are against the death penalty. So that aspect of research is fascinating, that someone whose spouse or child was the victim of a gruesome crime would then advocate not for the death penalty. So that's an interesting aspect also. These collections are the way that historians, whether students or professional scholars or journalists, this is how people research and write history. They use primary source documents as evidence to prove their argument. They use primary sources to document the people and organizations that they're writing about. Essentially, this is the raw material for historians and historical researchers to provide evidence for history. I always like to say that a historian is very similar to a lawyer. They have an argument, and they need to present that argument and present what their thesis is. Then they need to provide evidence to back up their thesis. Well, here at the Archive and Special Collections, we take care and we manage all of that evidence that historians have for research and writing purposes.